Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Bert Koenders, who is the Koenders Professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands and the President of the Dutch Advisory Council on Peace and Security, as well as the former Foreign Minister for the Netherlands. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
We'll start with the topic that's on everyone's minds these days on Ukraine. I'd like to ask you, if I may, how predictable was the conflict in Ukraine? Here in Italy, we're getting a lot of, there's a vocal minority who have been blaming NATO, even the Pope yesterday, and the US hegemony. Is there much truth in that? Did the West, in fact, sleepwalk into this conflict?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me and having this interview. I'm an old alumnus here from the Bologna Center in the beginning of the 80s. And my own past is a lot, as you mentioned, in foreign policy, but also in peace building, especially in conflict prevention. And before I answer your question, may I just say one thing? When I came in this morning, I remember there was a colleague from the European Union talking about conflict prevention. And I thought about the time that I started thinking about this, how you could prevent conflicts. The first conflict I was involved in was at the time Kosovo. And as you know, conflict prevention did not work there because we had a horrible war in Kosovo. And my sense is, and that's why I'm so happy you asked this question already, that we have to make this linkage, which you had in a debate today, between technique, building conflict prevention mechanisms, and politics. How do you make these come together? In Kosovo at the time, nobody actually wanted to put political energy in preventing a war, and therefore it didn't work. If you really invest a lot in conflict prevention, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to your question in a second, but if you invest a lot in conflict prevention, the conflict doesn't occur. And therefore you have invested in a lot, but you don't, from politicians' side, they don't get any benefit from it. It sounds simple, but this is something that happens very often. There is a great chapter.
You mentioned Barack Obama.
Barack Obama, yeah. There's a great chapter from Barack Obama in his memoirs, in which he writes about the risks of a pandemic. This is in 2008. So he writes about 20 pages, interesting to read, how he actually invests in avoiding, at that time it had something to do with SARS and avian flu and the risks for, in this case, the US, that nobody was actually aware of, but he was, as president, he wanted to prevent the pandemic. It took him 40% of his political energy, but the pandemic didn't occur, so he was successful. But everybody blamed him that he wasn't doing other stuff at the same time. So this is some of the issues around conflict prevention. It's much more complex than this. Look, let me get back to this horrific war we have in the Ukraine at the moment, and these massacres that take place every day. I think it is, talking about conflict prevention actually makes us extremely humble when I look at what's happening in Mariupol and in Bucha and in other places. As we speak, this war is of a ferocity and a cruelty that is enormous. Let me talk about my personal experience as foreign minister here. Could we have prevented this war, and is there somebody to blame? I'm not sure that the blame game here is the most important. My sense is that two things came actually together, and I saw it in 2014 when in my own country we were all shocked by the fact that this airliner, the MH17 from Malaysian Airlines, I don't know if some of you remember that, was shot down by a Russian Buk missile above the eastern Ukraine. And you saw in my country that was only to a certain extent interested in the fate of Ukraine and in the relations with Russia, woke up to the reality of this, in which in this case almost 200 of our people were killed, innocent people that went to the International AIDS Conference in Kuala Lumpur. And I remember very well that after that horrible event, I had to go to Moscow and discuss this with Minister Lavrov. And then I realized what actually where we were. I was in front of a foreign minister with a long history of knowing his business, knowing his files, representing the Russian Federation, but coming already at that time in front of me with complete fake diplomacy. He had like 6 or 7 different theories about why this plane had gone down, but nothing had to do with any reality.
What were your impressions of him as a person?
My impression was, I knew him before him, and he's been for a long time a UN permanent representative in New York. Was known to be extremely tough, slightly arrogant, but very detailed on the knowledge of diplomacy. But I have seen him throughout the last couple of years more and more taking distance from his professionalism as representing, if you like it or not, the interests of the Russian Federation, to an instrument of fake diplomacies and lies. I mean, it's unbelievable if you still can say today in Mariupol that, you know, nobody is being killed and that it's all Nazis and that there is a Nazi conspiracy in Ukraine and so on and so forth. Whatever your view is about this war, it is, we're living in a world, and we talk about conflict prevention, in which it is possible that in the autocracy that Russia has become throughout the years, a complete different reality of the majority of the population would think about what this conflict is. I'm not talking about the origins, but about what is happening. Then we, which have much more open channels of news. That's an enormous difference. There is a reality of complete fake news and of propaganda. And as you know, in any war, the truth is the first victim. I'm not saying that there is no propaganda also here, but it's incomparable. And I saw Lavrov becoming a man who is nothing more than a liar at the moment, who is now supporting, and I don't like to say that, by the way, I've met with him several times, but supporting massacres by invented stories. It's pretty serious. And that makes it very hard when you talk about conflict prevention or future diplomacy, which in my view is needed in any case to end this horrible war, how to deal with that.
But you were foreign minister at the time of the first Ukraine invasion, and how far did that conflict and the agreements afterwards, Minsk and so on, set the stage for what's happened now? And what's the West's responsibility?
The responsibility is, first of all, of course, look, let me say 2 things, maybe regarding also the topic of this conference, which is conflict prevention. We will talk, I think, a little bit later about conflict prevention of conflicts within a state. And we talk about Mali or the Horn of Africa, although that's also more and more a regional issue. Here you talk about a security order, in this place, the Western security order in Europe. And I'm raised in this school and university also that we needed to find in Europe a security order based on common security. Nobody could be secure without the fact that the other side would be secure as well. Now, there are different schools of thought, and I'll tell you where I am, but one school of thought is basically, it's not the West that won the Cold War. It is the East, if you wish, that lost the Cold War by the collapse of the state and communism. Yes. And that after that period of 89, the West should have come up. I don't agree with this, by the way, but there are far arguments in this, that like after the First and the Second World War, you need to be generous to the side that loses. And that many in Russia felt humiliated, and that they were not accepted anymore as a superpower, which they were. In fact, they are not. Russia has the same GDP as Belgium and the Netherlands together, 2 small countries. Sometimes it's seen as a big territory with a very small GDP and nuclear weapons. And we see that now happening, that in fact they also have an army which has a logistics and a morale and an organization degree, which is extremely limited. But in any case, so there's one school of thought who basically says that, yes, there has not been enough generosity. There's been an enormous amount of wrong advice from the West in terms of privatization of Russia, with a lot of poverty and inequality and oligarchy, and now sort of a system of state capitalism in which a few oligarchs run the show. And the second would be around NATO enlargement, that NATO enlargement would be seen in any system of common security as helping one, but maybe threatening to the other side. That's a part of the argument. And I think there was always some truth in these arguments. It's not completely black and white. There is also another side, which I think has become more apparent in the last couple of years. That is to say that most of the countries that became a new member of NATO were doing that not because they were forced by anybody, but their people were fearful of what would happen if there would be a resurrected Russia. And they are seen now that they are proven right. You see what happens if you don't get the free choice. You're basically being destroyed by missiles and so on and so forth.
Could we have perhaps prevented the conflict by making Ukraine a member of NATO instead of leaving it in this limbo?
I think it's a very good point. I think one of the decisions was taken in 2008 was a very bad one. In 2008, the decision was taken by the NATO. At the time, it was President Bush, who was a US president, and the Europeans in NATO, basically saying, Ukraine shall become member of NATO, but not now. And leaving in limbo when they would become a member. And that has been exploited since then. And I think that's exactly why we see now that Putin has exploited that ambiguity by wanting to forestall membership, and you see that also in Zelensky, President Zelensky, to a certain extent, saying maybe we could agree on a certain amount of neutrality. But the last point I want to make on this, because I'm sure that also in this audience maybe there are different views on this. When I went to Russia in 2014, there had already been the Russian invasion in Georgia, and we saw a continuation of not only oppression within Russia itself, especially among NGOs and freedom of speech and so on and so forth, but also that this autocracy was getting smaller and smaller. The history we've had, even in the Cold War, was
smaller.
That the world was being smaller. There were the big oil companies and the big enterprises who still knew to make deals with Putin, as we see with the consequence we see right now around gas and oil, and the strengthening of oligarchs there. But when you need each other on nuclear disarmament, on conventional disarmament, about the risks of technology and nuclear war, you need to talk to each other. And we saw more and more that circle around Putin became 4 or 5 people. And my fear is that, and therefore there is something also on the other side of the argument, that if a state with nuclear weapons becomes so autocratic, like we see right now in Russia, where people even live in a different reality with suffocation of free press and all that, that the risk of war becomes very, very, very big. And then you can see this mythology of a leader that completely misjudges the situation, his own army, the unity of the West, the unity of the Ukrainians, the reaction to it. I mean, he has miscalculated everything you can imagine. And that is the risk of an extreme autocratic leader that comes from the secret services in Russia, has never done anything else but appoint secret service colleagues around him, whom now make up the power hierarchy there. Could it have been prevented? Yes, I think no. Well, listen, let me be a bit more clear about that. In 2014, whatever the history was around this end of the Cold War and how you are in NATO enlargement and security and so on, the free choice of people to go to NATO and others perceiving that as a threat, I think in 2014, for me, it was very clear that at that time, the European Union was actually weak on all sides, on deterrence, on defense, and on diplomacy. Because you always have to have diplomacy as well. And all these 3 were not a priority. I think we could have done a little bit more about the Minsk agreements. But to be very honest, I don't think this war, even when Macron was discussing this in the end, and there were some issues around the new security order and arms control. And so at the end of February, I think Putin had made up his mind. I don't think that could have been prevented. No way. I think his mindset was one of an autocratic leader in a very small power circle who misjudged the situation, and the price is tremendous in terms of, refugee flows, internally displaced people, people being killed. It's a horrendous war.
Yeah, in many ways. Ukraine, for better or worse, did not join NATO in 2008, and now the discussions are very intense around it possibly joining the European Union or a second-tier European organization. But as foreign minister at the time of the Euro Association Agreement with Ukraine, do you think that the process of binding Ukraine to Europe could have avoided the war, or could help with other countries that now fear Russian attack, like Moldova?
Well, first on the Euro Association Agreement. The Euro Association Agreement was an agreement that linked the European Union and the Ukrainian government and state closer to each other. What was part of that discussion? It was about anti-corruption, it was about exchange of trade, it was about certain issues around standards and so on and so forth, which you see with many other countries. This was, of course, something that was debated heavily in Ukraine. There were differences of opinion. But to me, there has never been any doubt, because sometimes we say, okay, in the eastern part, in the Donbass, they were all pro-Russian, and the Polish side, they were all pro-Europe. I think it was much more complex than that. You saw in the Ukraine, maybe you have 10 different Ukraines with different balances in how you want to cooperate, but there's no doubt. And I think there's the misjudgment of Putin and the Russians, that Ukraine, first of all, wanted to be an independent state in 1991. That we see now how this country has unified itself. And that also the Euro Association Agreement was seen as something that could help them in its fight for more democracy and improvement of the situation. So I was in favor of that Euro Association Agreement. In my country, there was a referendum, especially from the Eurosceptic side. They misused a bit the Ukraine issue on an issue that actually was about the future of the European Union. And the majority voted against. And this, I mean, I had an enormous issue, of course, as foreign minister, how to deal with that. We had the European presidency at the time, how to deal with the Ukraine on this. I don't think, even up till the day of today, that Euro Association Agreement is the cause of the war, nor should it had not gone through. I think there was a clear democratic wish of the people of Ukraine to be part of this.
And would it help them to now have a kind of form of closer association with the European Union?
Yeah, now we are in a completely different
membership.
Yeah, we are in a completely different ballgame, because now whatever debate you could have about EU enlargement or NATO enlargement is now completely different, because all these countries that feel threatened by Russia, correctly or not, but they have seen what can happen if you don't defend yourself or you're not part of a club. You want to be part of that club. So the European Union is extremely popular. It's always been there, but now it's even more so. I would think there is no alternative right now than giving it a European perspective to the Ukraine. But it's not only in the Ukraine. We see now the same risks to a certain extent for Moldavia. I was just 2 weeks ago, or no, that's not true, 3 weeks ago in Bosnia, and you see the enormous fear in Bosnia, because in Bosnia you have, as you know, since the Dayton Agreement in 1995, you have basically three entities, the Republika Srpska, of two entities, Republika Srpska and the Federation of Bosniaks and Croats, and they have three presidents. By the way, this will teach us maybe later in the conversation something about peace agreement, bottom-up peacemaking, and the risk if it's an elite deal, which leads to sort of a corruption of the society. But in any case, Bosnia has not been able to agree even on a position on Russia, because these three presidents, in a country of only 4 million people, they don't agree. And they feel now that the Russians are, through Serbia and through Dodik, which is now the president of the Republika Srpska, thanks, is actually steering up now new violence. And when I was there, people were extremely fearful, because they thought back on Sarajevo in 1992. They went even to the banks already, even it was not necessary, because they were afraid that war would come. And as you know, fear is one of I think that was discussed in your meetings here this morning, fear and hope, and how people and groups react to that make a big difference on the risks for conflict and war. And I see that in Bosnia right now. And my sense would be that we have an obligation, first of all, to ensure that the peacekeeping force of the European Union in Bosnia-Herzegovina remains there, which is not so easy, because it has to be approved also in a legal context by the UN Security Council, in which Russia is a member. And also give them some perspective, again, of a European outlook. And this is a dilemma, because the country itself is, to be very honest, I don't have to be, and my friendship with Bosnia is enormous, and I have many friends there, but it's corrupt. These three entities have become political marketplaces, and the whole young generation who believes in its own future and in peace is leaving the country. In Italy, they are in Germany, they are in my country. It's very, very sad that, you know, this peacemaking in Bosnia with Dayton as an elite deal between the three groups has not led to sustainable peace in the country.
Perhaps it will be interesting to see if the European Union, which has maintained the peace by creating a kind of common economic bond between countries, can still function in that way if it expands to include the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova.
Yeah, I think, and it depends, first of all, always of the wish of the people in those countries. I don't know exactly. In Moldova, I think there's clearly a majority that would like this, although it's been also very much split. Ukraine is very clear now that they want this. And I think it's important that we maybe come up with something that is in between the complexities of this bureaucratic process, but it's a bureaucratic process for good reasons. Look at what's happening in Hungary and Poland on the rule of law, but still binds them to Europe. Some in-between formula that could give them more tangible European perspective. I think you see now, I think even Prime Minister Draghi in this country and others have tried to figure out what this means, because the world has so quickly changed and we have to stand back and think what it means. You don't want only to go into a confrontation with an isolated, impoverished, aggressive Russia, but at the same time, it's also very understandable that people want to defend themselves against these horrors that are happening right now. And in that balance, I think we have to make sure that the European Union remains as much as unified as possible and takes in people who have the democratic wish to be part of that.
Because the European Union and the West really is quite a small club. Only 20% of the countries in the world are actually supporting sanctions against Russia.
I think this is a very, very important point that you're making.
How does the rest of the world see this conflict?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are two things to this. It's the definition of the conflict and the interests in the conflict. I was not so long ago in the Middle East, and you see there different perspectives. First of all, is this now the definition, is this a fight between Russia and the West, to the extent that the West still exists, or is it a fight between Russia and the rest? Point number one. Secondly, is it a fight between autocracy and democracy, or is it much more complex? Is it a geopolitical fight about power in the world? What struck me is this. First of all, the United Nations. In the United Nations, because of the veto power of Russia in the Security Council, of course, 141 countries, a large majority, voted in favor of condemning Russia and telling them to leave. That's something else. I think your point is well taken, as being really convinced that they also should have the sanctions. And there I see different groups. I see, if you look to, for instance, to the big countries, you know, Brazil, South Africa, India, China. China and India, by the way, these are talking about half of the world population. They sit on the fence. China has clearly said we support Russia in terms of our relationship in the geopolitical fight that is existing in the world. They're our allies. And therefore and you see that in the discussion, they have a hard time because at the same time, they believe in the Charter of the United Nations, which is the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of nations. So China is watching, but in the end, closer to Russia. India, which imports a lot of weapons from Russia and also tries to find its road, is also sitting on the fence, you could say, in the sense that they are not condemning Russia. In Africa, it's very complex. You see countries that will say, here, the West with its double standards. In the Middle East, the same thing as well. You're now being so upset about Ukraine. Why not about Syria at the time? Refugees. If you are a refugee from Afghanistan or Syria, you have trouble getting into the European Union. We have seen the horrors of people being killed in the Mediterranean. This country specifically, you know, I mean, Lampedusa has seen its enormous consequences of it. Well, at the moment you're from the Ukraine, you can openly get there. So the view, I think, in the world is mixed. I think a lot of countries are sitting on the fence in the sense that they think, okay, the world has changed. It's not only the West. The Russia is losing power, but still we can use some countries like Mali. They are now importing military from, you know, these militias from Russia. And they have a direct interest in good relationships with Russia. And you have others like Kenya, for instance, who basically condemned very strongly Russia and said, these are the new colonizers. They colonize in other countries, they just invaded it.
They're in the minority, those countries, I think, in Africa.
I think it's unclear. I think all these things are at the moment unpredictable, as this war outcome is unpredictable, as most countries would sit on the fence for different reasons, short-term or medium-term interests. And therefore, this will change world politics much more than the conflict in Ukraine itself. But where it exactly lands, I see a lot of analyses on this, but you know, I have always a lot of respect for people who know already what the outcome is. I think it's still unpredictable, those new geopolitical situations are being developed as we speak and as countries make their choices.
You brought us onto the UN. Guterres' visit to Kiev and Moscow was seen as very late. The UN's recent record on conflict prevention in Afghanistan, Syria, the Sahel, where you've been working, and Iraq hasn't been very positive. But how is this conflict and the other failed conflict preventions going to reshape the potential for the kind of collective peace and security system, including the UN? And
yeah, it's the easiest question you have put forward. Look, full disclosure, I've been a UN Under Secretary General and Special Representative in Mali and Ivory Coast. My heart is with peace building and mediation. And I see with horror how this is failing at the moment. But that's not enough. Looking at a failure is not, you know, failure is not an option, so to speak. To be very honest, I think that although, and talking about the Ukraine, I think the Secretary General has been too late. I understand that it's not so easy if you're the Secretary General of the UN and one of your members of the Security Council has veto right. There's very little room for maneuver, to be very honest. He can be kicked out the next day, so to speak. But I find when this is happening, this massive invasion, like you know, you have seen the civil war in Syria, but this one is close to the horrors and refugees and all this. You have to be there. You have to take the risk. I don't know why the Secretary General, not from 2 months, week 2, didn't go to Kiev and Moscow and China and Europe and other places. You are the bastion of the international community. The Charter of the UN, we the people fighting against the scourge of war, is being destroyed in front of your eyes. You have to take certain risk, although I realize it's difficult. Having said all that, there is another side. Don't think that the UN is not doing anything. They were with, I think, 800-900 people now in Ukraine, in Mariupol. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees is doing an enormous job. Italian, Filippo Grandi, is doing a terrific job on helping all these internally displaced and refugees. You have Martin Griffiths, United Nations Organization for Humanitarian Aid, who is helping tremendously the situation right now, which is extremely complex because Ukraine is still there. People have no money, they have no food, they have no nothing. I mean, we can talk about the big stuff, but first things first. So there's that side of the UN. Now on conflict prevention and conflict management, there are also some opportunities. They are small, I realize that. But let's try to see where the niches are. The fact that the world is shifting so quickly in unpredictable ways, we don't know exactly. You see, an American retrenchment from Afghanistan and from the Middle East. The Russians will probably retrench also somewhat because they are weakened by this whole conflict. You see already that, for instance, in Yemen now, that creates a certain opportunity to come back to peace discussions. And my hope would be, and that's why this meeting here is so important, that is a peacemaking that is different from what we know traditionally. Traditionally, I think you were saying that today, between technique and politics, peacemaking is not a toolbox. It's not elections, a peacekeeping mission, stabilization, top-down peacemaking. In Yemen, we have a chance to listen to the people of different parts of Yemen. Maybe there is an opportunity there. I don't know. We'll have to see. And I see the special representative doing that and also looking much more for much more inclusive ways of peacemaking. There are little glimmers of hope there. On Afghanistan, I am amazed, and tomorrow I'll go to Rome, to your foreign office here, but the same goes for my country. So we're 20 years engaged with Afghanistan. And we all know that Afghanistan was not a peacekeeping mission. It was partly an anti-terror operation. It was an operation of wrong peacemaking, in my sense, in which you put money at a problem with warlords rather than sort of community building. But there were also aspects of that. But whatever happened, if you leave from one day to the other, you cannot just leave people like that. I think it's a shame. 20 years of enormous engagement from with Afghanistan. And now all their assets are frozen. There's an enormous human misery. There is an enormous discussion about women's and girls' rights, which I think is absolutely correct. And the discussion should be, what should we do in this context?
Yeah, the risk now is that we forget to engage in other conflict situations.
Totally. But already before Ukraine, Ukraine is not the reason of that. The reason is that, and that's why people often don't trust peacemakers from this part of the world, and I include my own part of the world, because they leave when they like. It's not if you are, whatever you think about the Afghanistan conflict, but if you go from one day to the other and you freeze everything and you just make sure that you get some people out, but you don't think about the people left behind. Anyway, that's a moral point of view. The realpolitik shows us that that's often the case.
What are the risks as to this conflict in Ukraine and the food crisis that is emerging as a result, sparking further conflicts in Africa, in Afghanistan?
I think it's an enormous
And how
issue.
can we prevent them?
Look, to be thinking first things first. We have at the moment a risk, as I was looking to some of the World Bank figures, that at the end of this year, we could have an increase in food prices up to 40%, of energy prices up to 50%. Now you take a country like Egypt, 80% of food imports comes from Ukraine and Russia. We have the same in the Horn of Africa. So what we have to do, I think, is very quickly see where the biggest vulnerabilities are that many poor developing countries have already after the vaccine apartheid that we have seen, and the way that they didn't have the same economic means that we have in Europe, at least, for counter-cyclical funds when there was the COVID pandemic. So there's already still living with this issue. And added to this is now this food and energy crisis. So my sense would be, if you talk about conflict prevention, make that immediately your emphasis of where, I mean, you have the structural conflict prevention when you talk about resilience, long-term institutions, you know, involving local people in making sure that they are not divided and so on. So, but you have also the immediate issues. And here's an immediate issue. I'm not saying that everywhere the food prices are high, you have conflict and people are rising up, but there are enough you know, serious situation is that we have already a drought and climate issues in the Horn of Africa, the same, by the way, in the Sahel. So it's not so difficult to figure out that if you do not have yet, and Italy is part of the G7 and the G20, the enormous need immediately is to make this a political issue of you know, of first priority.
So not just humanitarian aid, but a political issue.
Yeah. No, it's, look, humanitarian aid is important, but it's obviously, before you know it, we spend everything in the world on humanitarian aid. We have an enormous amount. We have at the moment in the world, I don't know, some of the experts here might know better, I think there are 56 places where you have low to medium in a conflict. The average time that a peace agreement is actually working is 7 years. In most of the countries we're talking about, there is a recurrence of conflict. So it requires two things: fundamental rethink how we do conflict prevention and management. And secondly, don't go from one extreme to the other, namely from overly top-down approaches from the outside to a sort of a retrenchment, as we have nothing to do with this anymore. That would be, in my view, politically a very wrong conclusion.
There's more things I'd love to ask you about, but I think we must just take a break and see if there's any questions from the audience.